Due Process, winner of 24 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Why race matters today and defies the logic of Bloomberg that this is really about saving black people and this is a colorblind public safety agenda is because no white community in America would tolerate this kind of treatment in the name of public safety in its communities, period.
Treatment like stop and frisk and mass incarceration of black men. Policies Khalil Muhammad says have their roots in the infamous Black Codes and Jim Crow. He's director of the prestigious Schomburg Center, author of an important book, great-grandson of Elijah Muhammad.
Salam alaikum.
And the only guest for this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from Genova Burns and the New Jersey State Bar Foundation.
In the world of African American studies, there is no institution more important than the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, that prestigious Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. So when an historian, an author with a Rutgers PhD, a distinctive heritage, and some controversial ideas was named to head the Schomburg, that was news. I'm Sandra King, and our guest for this edition of Due Process, Schomburg director Khalil Gibran Muhammad, author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race Crime, and the Making of Modern America. Selected for the Schomburg job by a panel that included scholar stars like Skip Gates and Eric Foner. Khalil, welcome back to Rutgers and to Due Process.
Thank you for having me on.
You are a scholar, a serious author, now head of the prestigious Schomburg, but you also have unique ancestry. You're great-grandson of Elijah Muhammad, founder of the Nation of Islam, one of the most significant figures in black liberation in the 20th century. Let's take a look.
Salam alaikum. In the name of Allah the Most Merciful, to whom praises is due forever, the Lord of the world.
How has that heritage affected you?
Well, I've had a lot of people invest in me. I grew up in a nurturing South Side of Chicago community that was deeply committed to black folk. I've known from a very young age where my great-grandfather built homes for himself, for his family in Kenwood and Hyde Park. And so I've always had a sense of connection to this amazing history. And I think that people saw things in me, even if it wasn't true, planted seeds of investment and expectation that most certainly have carried me over the years into the position that I am in today.
Is there a continuum from the kind of impact that Elijah had to the impact that I know you want to have? I know it from reading this book. I know it from what you're doing at the Schomburg.
I don't know that it was conscious, particularly as a young adult. I decided at 22 years old to go to graduate school, leaving a career in business behind. I worked for a Big Six public accounting firm out of college. And so I can't say that, that it was always foretold or in the cards. But I can say that once I was committed to understanding African American history and particularly focused on issues of social justice and economic inequality and racism that I wanted to have as big an impact as I could have.
You came here to Rutgers for your PhD. What were you expecting when you arrived here in terms of what would come next? Were you going to be satisfied to be an academic?
So yes, and in fact, I call myself a born-again academic. And the reason that matters is because having worked for a couple of years in corporate America, in fact, I had an internship at Prudential at the Gateway Plaza in Newark. And that was the beginning of the end of my career in corporate America because I thought I'd go into finance. I was bored to tears working on a trade floor. Decided to do accounting, was bored after a couple of weeks, but it took me 22 months to leave. So when I got to Rutgers, when I entered the PhD program, I knew that there was nothing else that I'd rather do than be paid as on a graduate stipend to learn the past and to groom myself to have a career as faculty. I was absolutely committed.
As faculty?
Yes.
That would have been okay for you. And you, in fact, you traveled that road once you finished. Then you headed where, and then what happened?
Sure. So I finished and went to Indiana University. It was the best of the job opportunities that I had at the time, finishing up my PhD. And the labor market was tight then for tenure-track positions, and it remains tight to this day.
Baby boomers won't,
they just won't go away in the professoriate. It's a great life. And so I was out at Indiana for 6 years, and I got tenure and taught a suite of courses on American and African American history.
And then comes a call? Is it that dramatic?
It was pretty dramatic in that sense, yes. I was sitting in my office in the summer of 2010, 8 by 8 foot cubicle facade office, nothing fancy, and a headhunter called and said, we're looking for a new director of the Schomburg Center.
You had not applied?
I had not applied, no. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And they said, well, you know, we thought we'd ask people their ideas about it. And I said, well, here's some ideas. And said, we'll get back in touch with you for more information. So I asked, well, are you talking about me being interested in the director of the Schomburg or someone else? Because they can go both ways. They said, no, we want to know if you're interested. And several months later, it happened.
And you said, yeah.
Well, yes, of course. Although I must say, these are the kinds of positions. I'm the 5th full-term director, meaning there were a couple of interims along the way, but the 5th in what is almost a 90-year history, an amazing history. So many amazing people have used the center, careers launched from the center. Ruby Dee just passed. She learned how to act there alongside Harry Belafonte. Maya Angelou was our national membership chair. So you don't plan to become the director of the Schomburg Center. You just hope for the best if you have an opportunity to have that position.
So the two examples out of so many that you just chose to mention, both cultural figures.
Sure.
And yet I think you're hoping and already have begun to bring something else.
Yes. So I thought of the Schomburg Center in terms of its cultural footprint as a place where writers and artists and poets would go to learn and be inspired. James Baldwin famously claims to have read every single book in the library. But I also knew it as a researcher. I knew it as someone who put it on a must-see list of archival material.
You had used the Schomburg.
I used the Schomburg to write what is now the Condemnation of Blackness.
Which we'll get to.
That's right. So I knew that it had the potential to speak multiple languages and across multiple platforms and audiences. And I thought, what a great way to take kind of the benign space of culture, and culture is incredibly powerful, so it's not really benign. I use that somewhat with air quotes. But to take a safe space that people don't feel threatened by in terms of its cultural impact and bring people into the conversations around social justice and political and economic struggle that is the 21st century problem, not just one that we inherit from the late 19th century or the early 20th century or the civil rights movement.
But the early 20th century and late 19th century is what you talk about so beautifully in this book, in The Condemnation of Blackness. You have a 30-second description of what you set out to do in this book?
Sure. I wanted to tell the story of the origins of everything that we think and assume about African Americans as criminals. And it's everywhere, this idea. It shapes our conversations about where our kids can go to school, where we should live, where we can play. And it's constantly evolving, but it's tied to almost a single thread of a kind of colorblind discourse of crime statistics. The idea that we know how much crime is committed by Black people tells us that it's okay to discriminate. It's okay to make assumptions about individuals within that group. And that's the story of the condemnation of Blackness. What makes it distinctive by comparison to stories that, say, Douglas Blackman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Slavery by Another Name, has told, is that this is a story that unfolds in Chicago, in New York City, in Philadelphia. This is more of a history of our moment and our time than is the story of convict leasing and chain gangs.
You also make the point again and again in this book that there were other groups who, mostly white immigrant groups, who arrived unprepared for life in urban America, poor, undereducated, great amount of crime, and yet that crime was received differently than Black crime. And the inability to change Black people from being criminals substandard in so many ways was so much a part of the white psyche, of the American psyche, that you describe the immigrant groups being raised up because there is a belief that at least they're white and therefore they are salvageable.
That's right. So one of the most common terms of these early days, the early 20th century, was that poor whites who might have been gang affiliated or criminally involved or living in...
And we know there were Irish gangs and Jewish gangs and Italian gangs.
That's right. In slum communities were redefined as a great army of unfortunates. So think about that, a great army of unfortunates, where
and therefore with good fortune.
So therefore with good fortune, meaning a social investment in the infrastructure of their communities,
will pay off and they can be real white people.
Redeemed, transformed, assimilated, Americanized. Those were all the terms of the period. But I think the key point in that has to be said is that their crime statistics were not used against them, but in fact the crime statistics were used as symptomatic, as evidence of social inequality, of economic injustice, of political and police corruption.
These people are committing crimes because of their misfortune.
That's right. Misfortune that is externally exposed. That's a key point, because in our contemporary liberal discourse today, and I'm not talking about the conservative right, I'm talking about the liberal discourse, misfortune can be read two ways. It can be read externally imposed, or it can be read in a more common way than which is read as this kind of unfortunate situation no one has any responsibility for, no one's to blame, we just inherited it, what are we going to do, throw our hands up. And what I'm suggesting is that the same external forces that bore down on European immigrant groups in the 1910s and 20s and 30s are still bearing down on African Americans. They were bearing down then, and they continue to bear down today.
And that's partially, you say, because there was a progressive movement that looked to help these immigrant groups and did, that somehow also looked at Black people as being other.
That's right.
And therefore not eligible for redemption in the same way.
Yeah. I'll give you a quick anecdote. So one of the most famous and important early criminologists was a liberal woman named Frances Keller. She wrote one of the first articles that looked at African Americans as women criminals, and she compared them to white women. This is at the turn of the 20th century. She described the problem of African Americans' criminality as a problem of them not being as sophisticated as white criminals. She talks about Black people couldn't break into a safe that a white immigrant could do, in lickety-split. So even in the space of criminality, there was Jim Crow segregation. Even in the idea of who's redeemable or deserving as a criminal, not as a poor person, liberals created a hierarchy that essentially assigned black people to a category where they were told they had to fix their crime problem first before other people could help them. It was just the opposite for European immigrants. They had to be helped first, and then they could help themselves. Right.
And then the whole aspect of the criminal justice system was just not looked at as we might look at it today. Why were so many black people arrested? Was there really that much more black crime? We could say the same thing, couldn't we, today?
That's right. So in that earlier period, there was far less sophisticated analysis of statistical regression. Most things were descriptive. So you counted the number of people in prison. You counted the number of people of arrest. In fact, it took until the 1920s or 30s to universalize arrest statistics in the uniform crime reports, the federal reports that today tell us how much crime, by race. It's interesting looking at NAACP archives because they were involved in researching the criminalization of black people. They're looking around the country for information about how many black people were arrested, even in places, even in counties of New Jersey. And oftentimes what they got back from county clerks was, we don't keep such numbers. So it's an interesting irony that the very tool that I am arguing becomes the universal language for stigmatizing and pathologizing black people, i.e. crime statistics, had to be constructed, had to be made. It didn't carry over from slavery. It was made in the early 20th century. And it is that legacy that is exactly what we face today with regard to how we define so much of black humanity. We literally define it through, well, how much crime are they committing? Does that mean they're deserving of access or not deserving of access?
But you know, you make such an interesting point in the book about those uniform crime reports. When there starts to be a delineation based on race and ethnicity, you get the foreign-born whites, blacks, and then the real whites.
That's right.
Right? And then a few years later, that disappears.
Yep.
And there's white, and there's black.
That's right. So that process is fascinating because it represents really the culmination of a couple of liberal sociologists. Edwin Sutherland is one of them, a guy named Thorsten Saline is another, and many African-American sociologists, Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harvard-trained sociologist, Charles Johnson. They're all in conversation with each other, and they're beginning to move the needle away from one that just uniformly stigmatizes most black people as criminals to one that recognizes some of these complexities, and particularly police involvement in over-surveilling black communities. So it turns out the uniform crime reports are far more sensitive in 1930 through 1933 to the problem of making racial claims about groups based on crime statistics than they are even to this day. And ultimately, what they see is that the foreign-born category is removed because another set of sociologists say, well, it turns out that the Irish and the Italians, when they commit crimes, it looks just like white people. So why even put foreign-born in them? What ultimately happens is notions of deviance that used to be inflected or disaggregated by someone who happened to be Italian versus someone who was native-born white shifts to, well, everybody's white who's normal, and everyone who's not normal is black. That's what those crime tables ultimately contributed to an understanding of.
Well, a friend once said something that always sticks in my mind, and that is that certain despised groups, like Jews, came to America and learned to be white.
Yeah, and it's hard to do if you have skin color like mine. You know, language helps, right? We organize society by the way people speak, by the way people dress, by the shape of their bodies, by their beauty, whatever that means. But skin color is hard to erase. You can work on everything else. You can speak the King's English, you can dress in certain ways, but it's really hard to whitewash one's skin.
As you researched this, were you surprised that the progressives, the so-called progressives, were as unfortunate in how they actually applied their progressive ideas? And is it any accident that somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois winds up being
on the far left?
being far, far to the left, because as we've seen in so many other places, where else do you go? Where else did you go before the Civil Rights era if, in fact, you looked at this society as it was and said, something's wrong?
Yeah. So I think I was surprised. I was a student of the progressive era before I settled on this particular topic, and it just seemed like for someone who was concerned about inequality as a college student, which was the transition I made in terms of caring about topics like this, yes, the progressives were heroes to me. And it was not until I began to study the topic as a graduate student, as an actual researcher, that I realized how complicated the legacy is that they left us. But I also realized that part of the power of the story of the condemnation of blackness through the lens of the progressive era is that they are us. We are them. They tell us more about ourselves than we'd like to think. And that is not just a white progressives problem, that is an all liberal black and white progressive and Asian and Latino. We all share this conundrum with regard to how we think about black people as criminals.
You stopped the book before World War II, and yet it screams out, look at today. So tell me, we've got, I think, a minute left. Tell me in, oh, we've got 3 minutes, so we can talk a little more. So tell me in 3 minutes what it is about all of this that has such application today.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway to our contemporary moment is, if this is a story that starts with what I call a data revolution, this is a moment for progressives when collecting reams of demographic data about industrial output, how many immigrants arrive at our shores, what is the cost of living growing up or living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. That's the moment for using data in the service of social good and social change. But it had its limits. And one of the lessons of that moment that is lost to our contemporary moment is we have to know when the data is actually serving our social good. And in this case, what progressives did with crime data was not to say that this teaches us that we must discriminate in the name of public safety. It tells us that something's wrong with our society, that we're not achieving social good if the outcomes produce this level of misery and pain and suffering. And yet our contemporary use of data, the same drivers apply, census data that tells us who lives where, how much money do people make, how many are arrested. Really the same raw data is produced, and yet we assume that because it tells us that so much crime is happening in these zip codes, that all we can do is protect ourselves from them. That requires a value system that progressives brought to their analysis, even if it neglected African Americans. What we have to do, the corrective in this moment, is to universalize the story of what we did to shore up working class communities. This isn't even just about progressives. This is about the New Deal. This is about the VA benefits that GIs received or GIs received under the GI Bill. We spent 8 decades in this country in the 20th century, from roughly 1890 to 1970, investing in working class communities. We built civilian conservation camps to make sure that young white men would work rather than be underemployed. And we can't find money today for some summer youth employment programs because we have produced the greatest levels of economic inequality in this country since the Great Depression, since before the New Deal.
So Khalil, with 40 seconds left, if the new mayor of Newark, Ras Baraka, were to say to you, help me, I now have the reins, what do I do about this most important issue?
Sure. So we have to expand our time horizons, meaning that we can't institute programs and expect to give some funder evidence that 3 years later it works. I just told you it took 8 decades to stabilize and create the greatest middle class in this country. So we've got to rethink and not let top-down philanthropic agencies tell us how fast it's going to take to turn a community around.
I hate to tell you, but I've
Yes.
got Pat telling me
That's right.
that our time is up.
Yes.
We could keep going, and we will. Please,
Yes.
please, please come back, because that's where we will have to leave it for now. Our thanks to you, Khalil Muhammad. Please do come back again. And our thanks to you for watching Due Process, for thinking along with us about tough questions of law and justice, and injustice too. We hope you'll join us again next week and every week, that you'll stop by our website, dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu, or follow us on Facebook and give us your ideas. For co-producer Tanya Bentley, for Raymond, who has this one off, and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Sandra King. See you next time.
Why race matters today and defies the logic of Bloomberg that this is really about saving black people and this is a colorblind public safety agenda is because no white community in America would tolerate this kind of treatment in the name of public safety in its communities, period. Policies like Stop, Question, and Frisk help to create the ghettos of Harlem, of Chicago, of West Philadelphia that were in their infancy at the turn of the 20th century. And all of this may sound appropriate to viewers listening today, except that the same didn't hold true for European immigrants. And so the very notion of refashioning their identity as a criminal identity was intended to be a mechanism to limit social resources on behalf of black communities, to effectively say, because they are criminals, they don't deserve even education.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.